Big Ted, to Rabbi Jonathan Gutentag, and all the many organizations that were responsible for this gathering today. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here, to be amongst so many friends of Israel, to be here representing the State of Israel, and to be here in Manchester. I had the opportunity to present my credentials at Buckingham Palace last week, but from the moment I arrived in the UK, it was made clear to me that I wasn't properly accredited until I had visited the home of Coronation Street, so it's wonderful to be here. Manchester has a very, very special place in Israeli diplomacy. One of my predecessors as ambassador to the UK, Yehuda Avner, is a very proud son of Manchester. And in my family, we're also very proud to have strong connections to Manchester, including, I would say, strong support for one of Manchester's football teams. I won't say which one, but I will mention that my father-in-law, when he got married here in Manchester many years ago, insisted that on the way to the wedding, the car should take a detour and drive down Main Road. But actually, Manchester has a more important role in the history of Israel, because it was actually here nearly 100 years ago that Chaim Weizmann started the journey that would lead him to be the first president of the State of Israel. He came here to take up a post at the University of Manchester, and while he was here, he established the Manchester School of Zionism, and it was his effort to recruit thinkers and activists and supporters like Israel Seif and Simon Marks and Harry Sacker and C.P. Scott that made Manchester the center of world Zionism. And if Manchester played such a crucial role in the battle to establish the State of Israel, I think what brings us all here to Manchester today is a sense that that battle is not fully over. The fact is that some 6 decades after David Ben-Gurion read out Israel's Declaration of Independence, Israel is still facing crucial and complex challenges on a number of different fronts. At the regional level, I think we have to go back probably more than a century to find a remotely similar period of upheaval and change in our neighboring countries. And as we look at the latest developments with looming elections in Egypt, at a new Tunisian constitution that prohibits any normalization with Israel, it is extremely troubling to see how quickly new freedoms can descend into old hatreds. And all the while, we're extremely concerned at developments in Iran, which continues its campaign against Israel, supporting terrorist organizations, denying the Holocaust, even while it tries as hard as it can to acquire the means to perpetrate the next one. And on the Palestinian front, we see a troubling change of dynamic amongst the Palestinian leadership. The fact is, we know that to get to any settlement, we're going to need a process of give and take. But the Palestinian leadership is now running off for unilateral initiatives within the United Nations, believing perhaps that it can take without having to give. But that won't take us towards peace. And the Palestinian leadership has to realize, as we do, that peace is going to require some tough choices. That you cannot have peace and have reconciliation with Hamas that calls for the destruction of Israel. You cannot have peace and refuse to recognize Israel as the state of the Jewish people. For 2 decades, Israel hasn't had a prime minister that hasn't accepted the idea of a Palestinian state. But we have yet to hear the Palestinian leader that accepts the idea of a Jewish state. And you cannot have peace and continue to teach your children violence and hostility with the kind of vicious incitement and demonization of Israel and Jews that we tragically see today in children's textbooks and Palestinian children's television. Thank you. These are important challenges on key fronts, but we have another no less important front, not on our borders but across the world, in Madrid and Johannesburg and San Francisco, in academia, in the media, in NGOs, in cyberspace, and I'm sorry to say, here in the United Kingdom. And that front is a campaign directed against the very legitimacy of the State of Israel. You know, people ask me, is there really delegitimization of Israel? Not just criticism, but a genuine attempt to question its basic sovereign rights. And I say, if you want to know the answer to that, don't listen to Israel's enemies, but listen to its friends, or at least the people that call themselves its friends. You know, I've lost sight of the number of times, I can't count the number of times that I've heard somebody say, I'm a friend of Israel, I support its right to exist. And I wonder, can you imagine anyone saying that in relation to any other country? I support Australia's right to exist, I support Guatemala's right to exist, as though that somehow makes me a friend of Guatemala. In relation to what other country does a discussion of policy descend into a question mark over the very existence of that state? And if we're going to be effective in countering this phenomenon, we have to be very, very clear about what it is and what it isn't. And it's not, for example, about human rights. We have to care about human rights, that's correct, but the delegitimizers don't. Because those same people who are so vocal about allegations of human rights violations in relation to Israel are totally silent when it comes to genuine human rights violations across the rest of our region. I've spent a lot of time in Geneva at the United Nations Human Rights Council, a staggering organization which has managed to pass more resolutions condemning Israel than every other country in the world combined. And when you stop to think about that, you realize that the real victims of that politicization are not Israel, but those people suffering genuine human rights abuses elsewhere in the world who never get the attention of the international community. And let's be clear, it's not about territory. It's not about occupation or settlements, although those are issues that we have to deal with. Our conflict has a territorial dimension. Territorial compromise is going to be a part of any solution. But if it was about territory, it wouldn't have been the case. It wouldn't have been the case that when we pulled out of every inch of South Lebanon, that was the cue for Hezbollah to fire 12,000 missiles on our northern towns and villages. It wouldn't have been the case that when we pulled out of every inch of Gaza, that was the cue for Hamas to wage its massive assault of missiles against Sderot and Ashkelon and Beersheba, and now even further north, placing over 1 million Israelis under threat of missile attacks. The fact is, like Hamas, like Hezbollah, the delegitimizers are not in a debate over where our borders are. Their question is whether we should have borders at all. And it's not even about supporting Palestinians. As Ivan Lewis said, this is not a zero-sum game. There is nothing that Israelis would like more than having a stable, prosperous Palestinian society living next door to us. Ultimately, the conflict is not between Israelis and Palestinians. It's between moderates and extremists. Not long ago, I was on a campus where there was a demonstration against me. A row of people stood up with tape and T-shirts under their shirts with slogans. And I had a laptop with me, so I pulled up a short video clip that some of you, I'm sure, have seen. It was of a Hamas terrorist in Gaza who was trying to cross a road. He had a weapon on his back, but he knew that when he stepped out into the road, he would be exposed. So what you saw on this short clip was that as he stepped out into the road, he grabbed hold of a Palestinian kid who must have been maybe 8 or 9 years old and lifted him up and carried him in front of him as he was crossing the road, literally as a shield. And as he got to the other side, he cast him aside. And I said to the demonstrators, I don't have a problem with you being supporters of the Palestinians. The Palestinians need supporters. But I want to know which of those two Palestinians you're supporting. Are you supporting that Hamas terrorist? Or are you supporting that kid that's not going to be capable of growing up to envisage a different kind of society? And I think that is the reason why delegitimization is not just a problem for Israel. It's a problem for Palestinians who genuinely want to build a better future. And more than that, it is a problem, a serious problem, for those institutions and organizations that allow it to fester. You know, when a university is not able to allow free debate, when a student who wants to speak up in favor of Israel is fearful of intimidation or even of violence, that's a problem for Israel, but far more than that, it's a problem for a university that's falling short of its academic standards. You know, when a leading newspaper publishes anti-Semitic canards, such as we heard on the release of Gilad Shalit, alleging that this deal shows that the Zionists value the lives of the chosen more than they value the lives of anyone else, as if we wouldn't have begged to reduce the number of terrorists that should be released in this deal. Yes, that's insulting to Israel, but more than that, it's a sign of a great sickness inside the media and inside British journalism. And when a trade union threatens to divest from the only trade union in the Middle East that is democratically elected, the Histadrut, so that it can cozy up with an extreme organization like the PSC, yes, it's a problem for us, but more than that, it's a sign that that union is losing touch with the core values that it should be representing. And when the United Nations or a non-governmental organization funds Palestinian textbooks that deny any Jewish historic connection to Jerusalem, or take the tomb of Rachel and rename it as the tomb of a Muslim prophet for political ends, yes, it's insulting to us, but more than that, it's an abuse of the right of Palestinian children to a genuine education. So although it's directed against Israel, this phenomenon undermines every institution or body that it contaminates. But even though it's their problem, we have to deal with it. And I think the good news is that we actually can. Eran Shaishun, who's done such interesting and important work on the subject, gave some examples of the successes that we can continue to have in the fight against delegitimization. Working together, we've managed to change the legislation on universal jurisdiction, to change the British policy, pull out of the Durban Conference. But to deal with this phenomenon needs some serious new thinking. I sometimes call delegitimization the alt-neu threat. Yes, it's new in the sense that it's broadcast through new technology and new media, and it's influenced by globalization. And yet at the same time, it's also a throwback to a historic opposition to the Zionist project that goes back way before the creation of the State of Israel. And so an alt-neu threat actually needs an alt-neu response. Yes, we need to develop new tools to deal with new technologies, but at the same time, we need to go back and revisit some of those old tools, like the tools that were used a century ago by Chaim Weizmann here in Manchester, to think about how we create networks, how we build alliances. And that's why it's so important and it's so appreciated that we have here with us today Christian friends of Israel as other faiths, and people across the board who recognize the importance of this struggle. But beyond that, we also need to think ahead. You know, the challenge needs a response today, but it's also going to need a response tomorrow. Who will be raising the flag for Israel in 10 or 15 or 20 years' time? We need to raise a generation of young people who speak up for Israel. And in order to do that, we need to engage and connect with them. We need to ensure that they see Israel not just as a cause to be defended, but as something to be celebrated. We need to make sure that they see not just this conference, but Israel as a big tent, like Abraham's tent, with many doors, so that each young person can find their passion and use their passion to connect with Israel and deepen that connection. And ultimately, I think this passion, this belief in Israel, is actually the core of our success. Yes, Israel has faults, and we have to work to correct them. But we have to remember that the delegitimizers and their hostility to Israel actually has nothing to do with Israel's faults. In fact, to the contrary, what it has to do with is Israel's success. You know, the fanatics who interrupted the Israel Philharmonic at the Albert Hall, or who protested against the Ahava store in Covent Garden, they don't care about Israel's faults. What they simply cannot accept is, despite all their efforts to the contrary, Israel is alive and well and flourishing and creating and inventing, winning Nobel Prizes and Academy Award nominations. It's reaching out to the third world with agriculture, with medicine, with water technology and disaster relief, and unbelievably, according to a recent poll, is the 7th happiest country in the world. That is the... That, we have to remember, is the Israel that we're fighting for. That is the Israel that our opponents cannot stand. And that is the Israel which, with your help, with all of our help, will continue to thrive and will continue to tell the inspirational story of a people that has finally come home. Thank you.
Well, I think we all know now that Israel's case is in the hands of a consummate diplomat during his term here in Britain. Thank you, Your Excellency, Daniel Taub. Now, I have to make a few notices for housekeeping. I'm afraid there's no...